Welcome to part two of our six-part presentation looking at the United States in the Cold War, American foreign policy from 1945 through 1972. And we were talking from the framework of our last presentation, looking at the presidency of Harry Truman, and stressing that Truman was in fact viewed, for all intents and purposes, as this accidental president. Someone who came to power, the American population only knew of him, placed as the vice president, or on the vice presidential ticket, so to speak, with Franklin Roosevelt in November of 1944. Following Roosevelt's fourth victory, he would become this new official vice president. But Roosevelt, as we know, although his inauguration is in January of 1945, he dies in office on April 12, 1945. And we stress the fact that Truman had just been vice president for a couple of months. He had been a senator from the state of Missouri, from Independence originally. And he had begun his second term as senator when he became, in fact, here the new president, or vice president, then eventually the new president. And from the standpoint of Harry Truman, as we saw from our first presentation, he completely opposed the Yalta Agreement. Now, Yalta had been made by Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill begrudgingly. And it stressed that the Soviet Union was going to have this free hand in Eastern Europe to set up these communist satellite states, provided that the Soviets agreed to declare war on the nation of Japan within 3 months of the defeat of Nazi Germany. Well, when Truman becomes president of the United States in April of 1945 and he learns of this Yalta Agreement, he's completely opposed to it. Because as far as he's concerned, open elections should be held. The residents of Eastern Europe should be given here the opportunity to decide what type of government they in fact formally want. Well, he begins to try and rally, as we saw last week, the American public behind his campaign. But the problem here is that the American population, having gone through the Great Depression, having gone through as well the Second World War, the last thing they wanted was renewed conflict. So although he's trying to rally here the Americans behind here in the aftermath of the Second World War, more of a get-tough strategy with the World War II ally, the Soviet Union, his appeals, for all intents and purposes, are falling on deaf ears. Well, poll after poll would show, from 1945 onwards into 1946, as we saw last time, that the American public trusts the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War II. Joseph Stalin had been portrayed throughout the Second World War in the American media as Uncle Joe. He was a good guy. And what you have is Truman, who is intent on following through a stronger policy against the Soviets. He really wants them out of Eastern Europe. And in 1946, as we saw last time, he would have Winston Churchill deliver his famous Iron Curtain speech. And Churchill here in Fulton, Missouri, Harry Truman's home state, is going to stress on March 5th, 1946, that this communist Iron Curtain has descended across Eastern Europe. This is wrong, this is unethical, this is immoral, and the United States must pay very, very close attention, particularly in the future, to the threat that the Soviet Union in fact formally represents. Well, once again, poll after poll showed that this really didn't shake the American population out of its doldrums. It wanted this return to normalcy. Well, the following year, everything would change. For in 1947, in March, you have these communist uprisings, as we introduced last time, in Greece and Turkey. And Harry Truman is going to go before the American population. He's going to stress here these communist uprisings in Greece and Turkey are basically being represented, they're being encouraged, they're being completely and utterly supported by the Kremlin in Moscow. Therefore, it is our opportunity and also our responsibility to step up here and to take on this communist threat once and for all. And I asked for $400 million in aid, Harry Truman stresses, from the United States Congress to be sent to both Greece and Turkey to help them fight these communist uprisings. Well, the aid is in fact formally sent. It is formally sent. And in both of these nations, of Greece and Turkey, these communist uprisings are put down. Well, there's no doubt that there were these uprisings, no doubt about that, but it's a little more sketchy as to if Joe Stalin and the Soviets were in fact actually behind it, as Harry Truman claimed they were. Well, it will also be in March of 1947 that Truman will usher in what becomes a foundation here of the Cold War. It is known as the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine stresses that the United States will defend any nation anywhere in the world that is opposed to communism. The United States, from this time onwards, will defend any nation anywhere in the world that is in fact formally opposed to communism. Well, historians would look at the Cold War here to formally begin today. And at the time, historians are writing in the 1950s, into the late 1950s as well, looking back at the origins here of this time period. As far as they were concerned, the Soviet Union was entirely responsible for causing the Cold War. With revisionist schools here that take place in the 1960s, but especially in the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, historians viewed the United States as being mostly responsible for the Cold War, that the United States overreacted. It was in a position of total and complete domination, as we spelled out last week when we were talking about the United States, not only as a military superpower, but far more important than that, an economic superpower in 1945 and onwards. And in this regard, historians in this 1960s, 1970s viewpoint saw the U.S. Well, by the time we get to the 1980s and up to and including the present day, most historians now looking at these early events of the Cold War will see both sides playing a role. The United States could be accused of overreacting, of using a water cannon, in fact, to put out a match because the Soviet Union was utterly destroyed by World War II. And it was going to take a long, long time for the Soviet economy to get itself on stable ground, perhaps decades, perhaps generations. That was painfully obvious. But by the same end here, the Soviets have this fear of encirclement. And what Stalin is doing, in essence, is he's setting the stage to have the United States and its allies encircling the nation, which is the last thing that he, in fact, formally wants. Well, how all of this would play out in 1947 wasn't entirely clear. But what is of concern for Harry Truman is the fact that across Europe, not so much Eastern Europe, as far as he's concerned, nothing's going to happen there. The Soviet Union's not leaving. He's like talking to Teresa, trying to get Stalin to withdraw from that area. His concern more so now is Central Europe and Western Europe. Because in the aftermath of World War II, these nations across the entire European landscape, it didn't matter whether you're talking Eastern Europe or Western Europe, economically were on really hard times. This was true not just of the defeated powers, nations like Germany, which is a nation at this time doesn't even exist, it's being militarily occupied by the Allied forces from World War II, here onwards into 1947. It's true not just of Germany and Italy, these fascist powers from World War II, it's also true of France. It's also true of Britain. And the concern on the part of Harry Truman is that unless these economies in Western Europe turn themselves around, and turn themselves around here very, very soon, in 1947, you may have the extremist element coming to the surface once again. And in this stage, his grave concern is communism. That these nations, these allies to the U.S. at this stage, the governments are so strapped financially, in many cases they're virtually bankrupt, that unless something changes very, very fast, you're going to have this turn into extremism. Extremism on the left-wing communism, potentially extremism right back like Nazi Germany had said, on the right-wing fascism, Nazism. Therefore, what Harry Truman decides, since the United States, remember, represents 6% of the world's population, it controls 63% of the world's industry and 75% of the world's capital here in the aftermath of World War II. What Harry Truman decides is to send billions of dollars, literally, to Central and West European nations. To drop, in essence, what he is going to call the Marshall Plan. Now, this Marshall Plan will be named after General George Marshall. Truly one of the more honorable figures in all of U.S. history, not just modern U.S. history, but I'd say throughout the entire history of the nation. From Uniontown, Pennsylvania, George Marshall was tremendously prominent, not just with the Democratic Party, but also here the Republican Party. And Truman is going to really, this could be easily called the Truman Plan. But he knows that if he calls it the Truman Plan, it's never going to get through Congress. Republicans are going to balk at this and want nothing to do with it. They don't like Harry Truman at all. He knows that. But by calling it the Marshall Plan, it'll be an easier sell. What is it? What this Marshall Plan is, which will be brought forth in June of 1947, is it is a massive economic stimulus package to the tune of $29 billion. $29 billion. Now, this $29 billion, you're going to drop this year over any nation that experienced damage in World War II. Well, there were over 50 nations in the Second World War. And one of the first nations to apply for Marshall Plan aid, no surprise, the island nation of Britain. The United States is going to agree. They're going to pump here billions of dollars into the British economy beginning in the summer of 1947. France is the second Marshall Plan recipient here. Second applicant, second recipient. So too would this be the case with the defeated Axis powers. Italy is going to apply for Marshall Plan aid. The once home of Benito Mussolini, the United States is going to pump billions of dollars into the Italian economy. So too would be the case with the heart and soul of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, the western part here of the militarily occupied area. The United States is going to pump billions of dollars into the former home of Adolf Hitler. Japan is going to also apply for and receive Marshall Plan aid. Well, when Joe Stalin and the Soviets see aid going to the Axis powers here by the late fall of 1947, as far as Stalin is concerned, we lost 30 million lives. We suffered $464 billion of damage in the Second World War. We were allies with the United States. They've given all their allies money. We're going to apply for Marshall Plan aid too. Well, from the perspective here of Harry Truman, when he sees the application coming forth of Soviet Marshall Plan aid, his response is, oh crap. And the reason being is that he is setting this up against the Soviet Union. He is making here these nations, these capitalist states, very strong with American direct aid. It's not alone. These are billions of dollars. This is just a huge windfall of money descending upon these capitalist nations in Central Europe and Western Europe. And he is doing this to keep the Soviet Union in second-class standing, to keep here this communist ideology in any way, shape, or form in terms of damage control of being attractive in Western Europe. So he doesn't want to give a dime to the Soviet Union. And now the Soviets have applied for Marshall Plan aid. Stalin doesn't see that it's being used against him. Well, what Truman did is he didn't want to say no. I mean, how could you give money to the Nazis and the fascists in Italy from just a few years before and not give anything to the Soviet Red Army and to the Soviet government, who were allies and fought against this right-wing menace? Well, what Truman does is he's going to tie strings to the application. He sends the application back to the Soviet Union, back to the Kremlin, and said that you may be eligible for Marshall Plan aid, but we're going to send over a number of auditors to look at your financial records and to see where you guys are at. And once we determine where you're at, then we will consider your application for aid. Now, he's not doing this for any other nation, but he's going to do this to the Soviets because he doesn't want to give the Soviets any money. Joseph Stalin realizes. He realizes the reality here of this aid. And what he does is he withdraws his application and he orders all 7 of those East European nations that he is in control of, communist satellite states, to withdraw their Marshall Plan aid for American aid as well here by early 1948. What this does is it further angers the Soviet Union. It further angers here the Soviet Union. And by 1948, there is indeed tremendous tension between these once World War II allies, the US and the Soviet Union, these two military superpowers. Well, as we talked about last time too, what we have here is a situation that what the United States is going to be following as a policy will in fact be the strategy of containment. Despite the grandstanding, the rhetoric on the part of the Truman administration, The Truman administration here, as far as it is concerned, publicly, the Soviets have to withdraw from Eastern Europe. The American population supports this now as well in 1948. Harry Truman knows privately that's not going to happen. It isn't going to happen. Yet, George Kennan, who we introduced last time, is going to have this policy, this plan here as an advisor to Harry Truman of containment. Let Eastern Europe go. Let it go forever. What we're going to do is completely surround the Soviet Union. They're paranoid of outsiders. They're paranoid of foreigners. And we'll completely encircle the Soviet Union, and eventually, this left-wing police state is going to fall apart from within. Contain the Soviet threat. From this time onwards, every inch that the Soviets, in fact, are going to threaten, we will be there to take a stand. So to a very real extent, this containment goes hand in hand with the Truman Doctrine, if that makes any sense. Well, as 1948 moves on, Joseph Stalin becomes all the more concerned, all the more paranoid, probably is the best way of describing it. Paranoid that his former allies from World War II, especially Britain and the United States, but also the nation of France, another nation he realized he could no longer trust by the spring of 1948, was working to undermine and perhaps even destroy the Soviet Union if they had this opportunity. And what really pushed Stalin over the edge was an event that took place, an event here that took place in May of 1948. Now, if you look up at our slide, you can see here this multicolored slide, and the larger part of the slide to the left. We have what is historically the nation of Germany. Adolf Hitler's so-called 1,000-year Reich that lasted 12 years and was reduced then not just to defeat, but also degradation. It ceases to exist because of this policy here on the part of the Allies of the, as phrased in the Casablanca Conference, this policy of unconditional surrender. Well, Germany ceases to exist effectively on May 8, 1945. And the Allies are going to split Germany into 4 zones, as we can see. We have a British zone, we have a Soviet zone, they're shaded in red. We have an American zone, we have a French zone. Now, not only are they going to do this for the nation of Germany, they are also going to split the capital city of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich here as World War II comes to an end, the city of Berlin, into 4 zones. So if you look in our lower right-hand corner, you'll see here in red, that would be the Soviet zone, blue would be the French zone, green here in Berlin would be the British zone, and that light tan would be the American zone. Well, what happens in May of 1948 is as follows. Harry Truman secretly contacts his British and French governmental figures, and he said to them, what we're thinking about doing here, and we want your support, is we want to take our 3 zones in the western part of Germany and join them together in 1 zone. We also want to take our 3 zones here, the British zone, the French zone, the American zone, in western part of Berlin, which is right here on our map. Berlin isn't just on the border. Berlin is hundreds of miles. It's deeply embedded in the Soviet military zone. We're going to take our 3 zones in Berlin, the British zone, the French zone, the American zone, and combine them into 1. And introduce here a new nation once again, a partition nation, the nation of West Germany, as well as a new city, a partition city, the city of West Berlin. The Americans get the British and the French to agree. Here's the catch. They're not going to say a word about this to Joe Stalin. The Soviets are going to know absolutely nothing. So they do this without informing Stalin in May of 1948. And the British, the French, and the Americans establish a new nation, West Germany. They take the 3 zones as well, deeply embedded in the Soviet sphere, in the communist zone here is illustrated in red, and in deeply embedded here, eastern part of the Soviet zone, what they're going to do is establish this new capitalist city as well of West Berlin. So you have West Germany capitalist, you have West Berlin also capitalist. Well, when Stalin finds out about this, he's absolutely enraged.
They didn't say anything to him that they were going to do this, just went ahead and did it. Okay? As far as he's concerned, the British, the French are nothing more than American puppets, lapdogs for the American imperialists. And Stalin, as far as he's concerned, his attitude is one of, okay, we're going to play hardball here? You're just going to do this without informing me? Fine. What I want, I'm going to establish here in my zone a new communist nation. A communist nation of East Germany. And, second of all, the three of you states, Americans, Britain, and France, you are all here going to withdraw from West Berlin. And what he does to force this withdrawal is he takes the Soviet Red Army, rumbles it here into East Germany, this new communist state, and he is going to take the Soviet Red Army and completely surround the entire city of Berlin, cutting off all roads, cutting off all train tracks, etc. So there's absolutely here no way anything can get in or out of Berlin. Now, the Soviet Union is going to keep supplying the residents of East Berlin in their respective zone. But as far as Stalin is concerned, okay, we've got this Cold War going on, you're going to play hardball with us, fine. Get out of West Berlin. It's deeply embedded in our zone. Well, from the perspective here of Harry Truman, from the standpoint of Truman, he is in a difficult situation, a very difficult situation, because he simply can't allow politically for this to happen and just withdraw from West Berlin. He's going to look weak. It's going to be like appeasement, as we talked about in our series earlier this year. Neville Chamberlain, Edward Daladier, bending over backwards to accommodate the right-wing scum Adolf Hitler. And all it did, in essence, is further empower Hitler. You've got to make a stand. So he simply is not going to allow for Stalin to force the Americans, the British, and the French out of West Berlin. But by the same hand, he doesn't want war with the Soviet Union. Not that big of a deal. So Truman begins to explore here in the summer of 1948. He begins to explore. In June 24th, when the Berlin blockade is formally enacted by the Soviet Union, the Soviet Red Army, he begins to explore ways around this. And what he wants to do here in the summer of 1948 is he wants to, for all intents and purposes, put the ball right back on the court of Joe Stalin and the Soviets. And he's not going to try and run the blockade. You try and force the American military in against the Soviet Red Army, blasting through these roads or train tracks, etc. That could be an act of war, or certainly could be viewed here as an act of war. What he decides instead is to begin here in the summer of 1948, to begin what is known as the Berlin Airlift. Now, he learns from his experts, Harry Truman, that for the West Berliners here who are deeply embedded in Soviet East Germany, across the city center from the East Berliners, which is being supplied and helped by the Soviet Union, that the West Berliners need 4,000 tons of supplies every day to survive. 4,000 tons. Well, what Truman is going to do is he's going to order the U.S. Air Force to fly round the clock over West Berlin. And here's a plane, here's an American plane right now coming over. And what they're going to do is parachute these supplies down to the West Berliners. The ball's back on the court of the Soviet Union. What Joseph Stalin can do is he can take here his flyers or big guns, etc., and shoot down an American plane. Put an end to that. That's an act of war. He doesn't want World War III either. So Stalin, from his standpoint, really has no choice but to allow for this to happen. And even though the West Berliners needed here 4,000 tons of supplies each day to survive, the United States will be delivering 11,000 tons of supplies every day to the West Berliners. They'll live better than they ever had since the end of World War II. There's no doubt about that. This is awesome. Absolutely awesome. And Harry Truman is standing with the American people at the time of the Berlin blockade will improve. Because as the months of July and August pass, The United States continues parachuting all these supplies. They're not landing. They're just flying over West Berlin. The West Berliners are thrilled. The Americans are dropping tons of chocolate for the West Berlin children as well as adults. This goes over huge, absolutely huge. And Joe Stalin realizes there's virtually nothing he can do. Although the blockade would continue into May of 1949, by the 12th of May, 1949, less than a year later, Stalin realizes it's not working, and he simply and very quietly lifts the blockade. Well, this first showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union, Truman and the Americans come out on top. Well, what will happen with this nation of Germany is you're now going to have in the area of the British zone, the French zone, and the American zone, this new nation of West Germany, which will also oversee this new nation of West Berlin, even though West Berlin is deeply embedded in the Soviet zone. The Soviet zone will now become a communist nation to counter capitalist West Germany. It'll become a communist nation of East Germany. What ultimately all this means from a big picture perspective isn't entirely clear. But the tension here in the Cold War will continue on, certainly, into the fall of 1948. Well, Harry Truman realizes as 1948 is progressing that he's in pretty significant trouble politically. He was never really overly popular with the American people, not in any way, shape, or form. But as far as Truman was concerned, he could care less. As far as he was concerned, he could care less. He came to be president. He came here to formally be president, not to win any popularity contest, but rather to do what he saw as the right thing. Well, he was raised off on the plains outside of Independence, Missouri, and he spent a lifetime here playing the piano, being very studious. He married here his kindergarten sweetheart, not just high school sweetheart, Bessie Wallace, who he fell madly in love with in kindergarten, and told her in kindergarten that someday he would marry her. Well, as far as Bess Wallace's mother was concerned, no one was good enough for her Bessie. And she didn't like Harry Truman at all. She lived well into her 90s, and even after he became president of the United States, his mother-in-law could care less. She didn't like it. She'd be the first to tell you that. She wasn't impressed. Well, for Harry Truman, his father is a farmer. They live outside of Independence. They moved, quite frankly, a number of times. He had a brother. He had a sister as well. And his father, in the early 20th century, was into wheat futures and was looking to, in fact, get rich quick. Well, his dad, John Truman, was also a very stubborn person. And John Truman realized that wheat futures were starting to lose their value, and he really needed to get out. But what does he do? He puts the farm, he puts the house on it as well, and the family ends up losing everything the year Harry Truman graduates from high school. College was out of the question for Truman. He took some correspondence courses in Kansas City, but from the perspective of his future, he wasn't exactly sure. He became here involved as well, or had been a World War I veteran, where he met a gentleman, Eddie Jacobson, who was very interested in starting his own clothing business. And the two would go in at the start of the Roaring '20s into this clothing business together. He became known as a haberdasher. If you ever look here at Harry Truman, in terms of, I would say, certainly one of the sharpest dressed presidents of all time. The reason being is that he is a former men's clothing store owner. Well, it started off good at the start of the Roaring '20s. Started off good here, and the profits were very good for both Eddie Jacobson and his partner, Harry Truman. However, by 1922, the agricultural sector in the United States was going into a slump. Buying here fashionable men's clothing was more of a luxury as opposed to a necessity, and the store fell on hard times.
they had to close by 1924. Now, everything was divided between the two of them. Eddie Jacobson ended up declaring bankruptcy. Harry Truman would spend the next 20 years paying off every single penny that he owed. He did not declare bankruptcy. But what it did is it really left him strapped financially, literally for the rest of his life. Never really got beyond it, to be perfectly frank. Well, as good fortune would have it, he had another World War I buddy, a gentleman by the name of John Prendergast, whose uncle, T.J. Prendergast, was this big political operative in Kansas City, the Prendergast political machine. And what he did, T.J. Prendergast, for Harry Truman, because of Truman's friendship with his nephew, is he was able to finance here Truman running for a position really as county commissioner of Jackson County, which is a seat here for the city of Kansas City. And Truman is going to make the skyline, in essence, of Kansas City really come to life. Truman was someone who worked super hard, was tremendously determined, and he would always hold true to what he was taught, I should say, very early on in his life by his mother and his father. And what his outlook was in this journey of life was as follows, and I quote, "Work hard, do your best, keep your word, never get too big for your britches, trust in God, have no fear, and never forget a friend." Truman would hold true to this throughout his entire life. And in the early 1930s, with the onset of the Great Depression, he was absolutely thrilled to just have a job as Jackson County Commissioner. Well, the problem here is in 1934, the stage was set that you could only serve here 1 2-year term from then onwards. Harry Truman had been Jackson County Commissioner for over 10 years, and now that prospect was gone. Once again, T.J. Prendergast came to the rescue. And he said to Truman, "Why don't you run for the U.S. Senate here as a senator from the state of Missouri?" Harry Truman's attitude was, "I have absolutely zero political experience." T.J. Prendergast said, "Don't worry. I'll help you there. You'll be fine." And he runs here on the Democratic ticket, and he becomes senator from the state of Missouri in 1934. When he arrives in Washington, D.C., there is no doubt about this, up to and including the present day. Harry Truman is the poorest of all U.S. senators. In the present day, I think 86 are multimillionaires. 86 of the 100 U.S. senators is very, very similar as well in the 1930s. Truman lived in a one-room studio apartment. He couldn't afford a car. He took the bus every day to the Capitol, back and forth. A lot of times as well, he slept in his office. Bess and his daughter Margaret did not come with him. And it was something that was very, very difficult. He was also very intimidating, because not only was he not wealthy, he also here had come close to filing for bankruptcy, which was tremendously shameful as far as he was concerned, but he got through this. And he did not have a college degree. All he had was a graduate from high school. It made him very, very insecure. However, some of Franklin Roosevelt's cronies said to him, "Harry, don't worry. Here is a new U.S. Senator. You're going to stop and you're going to wonder, how the hell did I ever get here?" Within 2 months, though, you're going to look around at your fellow Democrats and Republicans, and you're going to ask yourself, how the hell did they get here? Don't worry about it. Well, he has this reputation for being squeaky clean, and indeed he was. Consummate idealist. He stressed in 1940 that 3 things can ruin a man: money, women, and power. And he said, "Well, I've never had any money. I'd like to see what that's like. Never had any money in my life. I've never been interested in power. And as far as women, well, I fell in love with her in kindergarten, and she's been my wife, and she lives right down the street here in Washington, D.C. So. He was who he was, quite frankly.
In his second term in the U.S. Senate, he set up the Truman Committee to explore wasteful government spending, kind of like a prelude for those of you from Milwaukee. Bill Proxmire, remember the Golden Fleece Award? It was kind of like a forerunner to Proxmire's Golden Fleece Award. This gained him a national reputation. And in 1944, of course, he's on Roosevelt's ticket. Well, now he is in a situation. He had become president of the United States, and there is grave concern on the part of the Democrats that he is in way over his head. He's no Roosevelt. They've stressed time and time again. Now we've got this massive problem going on with the Soviets. And to make a bad situation worse, in the midterm elections in 1946, midterm elections are never good for the political party that's in the White House. You're usually always going to lose seats in the House of Representatives or seats in the U.S. Senate. It's not a question of if you're going to lose, it's how many seats you're going to lose. Okay? In the pendulum swing of American politics. Well, in the midterm elections of 1946, the Democrats lost control of both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. The Republicans had not been in control of either house since 1930, since right when the Great Depression was starting. And it did not look good as 1948 progressed. Well, Truman wants to remove, he wants here to formally remove this moniker of being the accidental president, if at all possible. He wants to get rid of this here once and for all. But it's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging, that is for sure. His approval rating was at about 42%, which was not good by any stretch of the imagination here in American society in 1948. And more so, more important than that, he will be taking on here the governor from New York who came pretty close to defeating Franklin Roosevelt in 1944 in November, Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey. Well, Thomas Dewey was described here by the eldest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, who was Alice Roosevelt, who was known for being a bit outspoken herself. She's quite the character. She described the governor of New York, this Republican Thomas Dewey, as the little groom on top of the wedding cake. I think he looks exactly like that. Okay? Description dead on. Here's Thomas Dewey. Okay? Remember those little wedding cakes? You have the bride and groom standing there. And the groom always had black hair with a little black mustache. Well, Thomas Dewey maybe was the role model for this. Who knows? Well, Dewey is very popular. He's very popular in New York. He's also very popular in the Republican Party. He is a liberal Republican, very, very progressive on civil rights. And he is accusing, as the Republican Party itself is doing across the board, he is accusing Harry Truman and the Democrats of being soft on communism. Well, if there's one thing that Truman and the Democrats are not, is soft on communism. I mean, Truman's being criticized privately by members of his own party for the sense of overkill regarding the Soviet threat. Using the water cannon to put out a match was a phrase that was used. Thomas Dewey, though, this challenger to Harry Truman, had two fatal flaws. Two fatal flaws. His first flaw is that he had no charisma. Now, isn't charisma something that's either there or it's not? It's not you wake up one morning and say, I'm going to go get me some of that charisma. Where'll I be right back? You have it or you don't. You have it here or you don't. And the problem with Thomas Dewey is he's a politician, but he's very cold. He's very pompous. And most important of all, he seemed really uninterested in people who were around him. Second of all, the second problem here for the Republican challenger, Dewey, overconfidence. This is not his fault. This is not his fault. Because virtually all political pundits, political experts across the United States gave Harry Truman no chance whatsoever of winning the election. And Dewey believed it. From Thomas Dewey's standpoint, he ran the best race of all against Franklin Roosevelt. and did not prevail in 1944. But now the tide is turned against the Democrats. The Republicans control the House, the Republicans control the Senate, and the Republicans are soon going to control the White House as well. Well, regarding this overconfidence, Dewey is not going to start his campaign. He will not start his campaign for the presidency until mid-September of 1948. Okay? Of course, the election's on that first Monday in November. And his speeches, as he's out on the campaign trail, his speeches, for somebody who has really no charisma to start with, were very bland. The Louisville Courier-Journal, which had been following him around on a number of campaign stops, Governor Dewey, summed up his campaign speeches to 5 sentences. Number 1, agriculture is important. Number 2, our rivers are full of fish. Number 3, you cannot have freedom without liberty. Number 4, the future lies ahead. And number 5, the TVA, or Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, the Tennessee Valley Authority was part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and it was a massive program, massive spending program, that really helped modernize much of the southern part of the United States, as well as the western plains as well, bringing electricity, bringing dams, etc., new roads, you name it. So as part of the New Deal of FDR, the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, he stated as follows: the Tennessee Valley Authority is a fine thing, and we must make certain that nothing like that ever happens again. Harry Truman was the exact opposite of Thomas Dewey. Truman's attitude is, hey, if I'm going down, so be it. I know I did the absolute best I could. It was wonderful being president. I am completely convinced I'm going to be reelected. Oh. It was stated here in the Democratic Party and nationally that two people believed Harry Truman had a chance in November of 1948. Harry Truman and his mother. Even Bess was a little iffy. She really didn't like Washington, D.C. In fact, she had been living the better part of his first term in office in Independence, Missouri. Well, the energy here that he put forth was quite extraordinary. He traveled 31,700 miles on train, beginning here in late July of 1948. Second of all, he stressed support for the expansion of Social Security, for an increase in the minimum wage, as well as inflation control. From Truman's standpoint, we're doing very, very well in this nation. Economically, we're doing the best we ever have up to this time. But we can be better. We can get better. We can take these proper steps. Third, he stressed his toughness. He stressed here his toughness. He wore glasses since he was 5 years of age. And by the same man that made him look, especially off in the plains of Missouri, he didn't see too many kids, boys or girls, who were wearing glasses. He was very much aware of this. His whole life he was dreadfully nearsighted. But here's his opportunity, as he would write later on, to show his toughness. The Berlin airlift, over basically here conquering, by the fall of 1948, Joseph Stalin's so-called Berlin blockade. And as he'd be doing these whistle-stop tours, just like his predecessor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had been doing, he'd come out the back, and one time he's yelling and he's carrying on. He's in Topeka, Kansas. And somebody from out in the audience yelled, "Give him hell, Harry!" That became his motto. Give him hell, Harry. Went hand in hand with the plaque he had on his desk in the Oval Office of the White House. The buck stops here. Other key sayings he had: if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Well, the Republican Party came back, they countered with what I would consider to be the all-time greatest campaign slogan. And it's directed right at Harry Truman in 1948. And that slogan was as follows: to err is Truman. Very clever, very clever. Within 10 days of the election in November of 1948, the top 50 political journals put forth who was going to be victorious in the upcoming election here in 48. All 50 political journalists picked Thomas Dewey. Gallup poll had this as 50% Thomas Dewey support to 45% to Harry Truman, 2 days before the election. The Roper poll had it as 52% Thomas Dewey to 37% Harry Truman. On the eve of the 1948 election, Colonel Robert McCormick of Chicago, publisher of the Chicago Tribune, who hated Harry Truman, hated him with a passion, was a staunch Republican through and through. When he's looking here at the early returns coming forth, McCormick decided to put forth here the headlines for the next day, the next morning news. The famous newspaper of Dewey defeats Truman. Yet Harry Truman prevailed. Truman won the popular vote by 49.6% to 45.1% here of Thomas Dewey. It was a great upset, a tremendous upset. But by the same token, it is also extremely difficult in American political history to defeat an incumbent. You don't want to be a one-term president. A one-term president is very embarrassing. For Truman, it was different. He could have sold it as, even if he lost, well, simply he was taking over for Roosevelt, the time had come to move on, and move on he would. Absolutely stunning defeat, considered the most significant political upset, up to and including the present day in U.S. history. Well, Harry Truman is going to begin. This accidental moniker that he had will in fact be formally removed. And he is going to begin now, he is going to begin his official term in office, of course, beginning in January of 1949. Well, the Cold War here is really starting to intensify. The American population is more and more concerned in terms of the future. Truman's popularity has etched up slightly, but by the same end, there's greater concerns here, and looking back, hindsight, of course, is 20/20 vision. It's very, very easy for me to stand and pontificate here 70 years later in terms of, oh, they shouldn't have done this, oh, they should have done this, oh, what were they thinking? But when you're actually going through it, it's a different sort of circumstances. What the Truman administration should have done, what the U.S. government should have done, though, nevertheless, is to basically prepare the American public that eventually the Soviet Union is going to have an atomic bomb as well. And this nuclear monopoly that the U.S. has is coming to an end. Not going to last forever, not in any way, shape, or form. Well, Truman decided against this. I mean, it was an election year. I mean, he realized it. I mean, it was a sense of Henry Stimson, Franklin Roosevelt's former Secretary of War, saying, listen, the Soviet Union is going to have the bomb within 3 to 5 years of the end of World War II. And by not sharing the secrets with them, because they're going to have it anyway, it's only going to create further tension. Truman's response to Stimson in the cabinet meeting is, what are the alternatives? Share the secrets so the Republicans can find out that I told the Soviets how to build an atomic bomb? That would be absolute political suicide. I can't do it. But what the U.S. government should have done is to prepare the American public that this nuclear monopoly that the United States had was not going to last forever. 1949 is the most critical year of all here in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, at least in the early stages. This nuclear age had ushered in an age of anxiety. And in July of 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. Now, the Soviet Union has as its spy apparatus the KGB. So the KGB is spying on all the nations. There's KGB spies in the United States, no doubt about that. The equivalency of the Russian KGB is the American CIA, which comes into existence here in 1947. And the CIA, what it does is it spies on other nations, gathers information, etc. All nations do this. You try and stay a step ahead. The bottom line is don't get caught. Don't get caught. Well, what has happened here is that the CIA learns in early August of 1949 that indeed the Soviet Union has successfully tested its first atomic bomb. This information is then put forth to the US government as well as the American public, and the US population freaks out. Oh my God, how could this have happened? Oh my God, now the Soviet Union has the atomic bomb. We had this nuclear superiority, we had this monopoly, it's done, it's over. How did this happen? Where are we going? So you have this population that is now very, very alarmed, terrified. Well, it's going to get worse. In the nation of China, geographically the Soviet Union is the largest nation in the world here at this stage. Historic Russia is as well, remains as such geographically in the present day. But the largest population in the world had been since the end of the 19th century is the nation of China. 25% of the world's population resides in historic China. A nation that was incredibly backward. Whether going back to the various dynasties here under the emperors and empresses in historic China, or the nationalist period under Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek. But what happens here in China, in this very backward, peasant-dominated nation, is in 1945, you have the formal end of World War II and the beginning of this Chinese Civil War. And the Chinese Civil War is going to pit Mao Zedong and the communists against Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists are going to control most of the cities throughout historic China, while Mao Zedong and the communists will control a great deal of the countryside, which is actually an advantage because 90% of the nation of China is rural, peasant-dominated. The United States government, 1946, is going to start pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist movement. They don't want to see Mao Zedong and the communists win. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, is also going to be watching this matter closely. And if we're going to be betting the family farm here, and we know that the Soviets are going to send whatever aid or weaponry they can muster, we would assume that the Soviet Union is also going to be supporting the opposite of the Americans, Mao Zedong and the communists. They're a communist nation. Spread communism from sea to shining sea from a global perspective. Well, the Soviet Union, realizing here that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists are losing in 1948, the Soviet Union is also going to start sending money, is also going to start sending weaponry. To who? To Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. Why? Because the last thing the Soviet Union wants is to see communism prevail in China. Because Stalin knows there is no way he can control that large of a communist nation. If he can completely control and dominate some little entity, he's all for it. China's too big. He can't do it. So the Americans and the Soviets are both supplying here Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. And Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, especially the Nationalist Officer Corps, is so corrupt and so pathetic that even then they can't get the upper hand. On October 1st, 1949, China falls to Mao Zedong and his communist movement. October 1st, 1949, less than 2 months after the United States, the American public has learned that the Soviet Union has detonated its first atomic bomb. Newspaper headlines across the United States blasted, "We lost China," like China was ever ours to lose. What happens here, Mao Zedong is livid with the United States for its support of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. He is also even more livid with the Soviet Union, that great communist state, supporting Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. The nationalists are forced off of mainland China to the island of Formosa, what is present-day Taiwan. Well, they will set up this government in exile, a government that's recognized in 1949 as the legitimate government of China. From the standpoint of the American public, the shock the paranoia deepens. The shock here, the paranoia deepens. The Soviet Union has tested its first atomic bomb, and now the nation that controls 25% of the world's population is also a communist state. Oh my God, what's going to happen next? What we see here in this Cold War is a bipolar world, truly coming to the surface. And in 1949, the United States is going to set up what is known as NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, if we look up here at our overhead, in green, that represents the NATO nations. So you have here nations like France, West Germany, Great Britain, Greece, Turkey, Italy, Canada, the United States. The United States is front and center as the force of NATO, and NATO stipulates as follows. If the Soviet Union ever attacks any NATO nation, it will be viewed as an attack on all. Now think back in terms of the present day, present politics. Russia and Ukraine, what's going on right now? What's going on right now is Finland. If you look up along the border here of historic Russia, they're in white at the very top of our map. Finland is looking to get into NATO. Sweden, also looking to join NATO. They want to be under this umbrella of American protection. And for good reason. They're dealing here with the scum of the earth, Putin of the nation of Russia. A stand has to be taken, quite frankly. So it's going to make NATO even larger, even more prominent. Yet the United States, the force behind NATO, the centerpiece here, would welcome these nations with open arms. Sense of collective security. So NATO has its origins back in 1949. Well, when this is introduced, it makes the Soviet Union more paranoid. Not being critical at all of the US and NATO, not in the least. But it makes your Stalin and the Soviets more paranoid. And Stalin is going to introduce at the end of 1949 the Warsaw Pact, as shaded in orange. As shaded here formally in orange. The Warsaw Pact stipulates as follows. If any NATO nation, or if any green nation here, is going to, if any NATO nation attacks a member of the Warsaw Pact, which would be the Soviet Union and the Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, East Germany. It will be viewed as an attack on all Warsaw Pact nations. This bipolar world is now complete. It is now complete. And the net result here is that you have this fear in American society to astronomical heights as 1950 formally begins. Well, adding to the problem, adding here to the concerns in the U.S. is the emergence of a junior senator from the state of Wisconsin who on February 9th, 1950, before Republican women's group in Wheeling, West Virginia, held up a piece of paper and he stressed the following. What I have in my hand are the names of 205 known communists in the U.S. State Department. Wow. 205. Now, the U.S. State Department, of course, then now specializes in foreign policy. It specializes here in foreign policy. And basically, the concern is, okay, how did the Soviets get the atomic bomb? Communists in the State Department. How did we lose China just a few months before? Communists in the State Department. Now, you have this junior senator who really did not have all that much accomplished, quite frankly, his first term as a U.S. Senator, suddenly bursting into national prominence. Joe McCarthy. And McCarthy becomes this demagogue, quite frankly, in a very, very rapid fashion.
But what Americans are seeing about McCarthy is they're not actually watching him in his tactics of berating, of basically bullying, really over-the-top behavior across the board. But they're reading about his accusations. They're reading here in terms of his statements. Well, on February 20th, on the floor of the U.S. Senate, Joe McCarthy held up another piece of paper, and he said, "What I have in my hand, the names of 57 communists in the U.S. State Department." Well, it had been just 11 days before when he said he had 205 known communists, and he hadn't put forth any names. Now it's 57. Then in Reno, Nevada, on February 23rd, he claimed that he had the names of 81 known communists in the U.S. State Department. Fear starts to transcend here American society. And the thing with McCarthy is he does not put forth the name of even one communist in his first couple of months. And the Democratic Party, from its standpoint, basically sees this as nothing more than partisan politics. Oh, just like the Democrats are soft on communism. 20 years of treason, as Joe McCarthy would stress time and time again. It's yet another political ploy that will take us absolutely nowhere. But the problem here is that the political climate is different. And the Republicans are very, very leery of confronting Joe McCarthy. They're leery of confronting Joe McCarthy because he might accuse you of being a communist too and ruin your career. Not only are the Republicans concerned, so too are the Democrats. He can destroy you. By the summer of 1950, he is still thundering. He loves the attention. He is still thundering about communists in the State Department. The question is, okay, where are these communists? Oh, they'll be coming forth. They will be coming forth. The only person who had the courage, quite frankly, wasn't any of the boys in the U.S. Senate. I can tell you that much. Far from it. They're cowards collectively. Cowards in the Republican Party, cowards in the Democratic Party. The individual who's going to confront Joe McCarthy will be a fellow Republican. A Republican here from the state. Sorry. It's always a bit of a problem. The state of Maine, Margaret Chase Smith. And what she is seeing initially was alarming. Okay, this explains a lot. We've got these closet communists in the U.S. federal government. But as McCarthy's campaign continues into the summer of 1950, and he hasn't put forth one name, she had the audacity, this woman, to ask for names. To take Joe McCarthy from Appleton, Wisconsin, head on. A showdown. One Republican against another Republican. And what is going to happen here, we will see in our presentation tomorrow at 2 p.m. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Any questions at all in terms of part 2? Yes, yes, ma'am.
Do you see some traces from that period to today's situations? You alluded that.
Potentially. I mean, I'd say that there's a case of from the standpoint in terms of what you see in terms of pendulum swings, you go from the standpoint historically of more of a liberal swing to a conservative swing, and it's, you know, when the voice of the conservatives is more prominent. As far as the liberals are concerned, the conservatives are taking us to hell in a handbasket. And as far as when the opposite is the case, and the liberals have a stronger voice in government. What I mean by a stronger voice is control of Congress, as well as the Senate and or the White House, then the conservatives would basically say, well, they're taking us to, we're going to hell in a handbasket because of liberals. I'd say there's definitely parallels in terms of the dangers of demagoguery. There's no doubt about that. The bottom line is with Joe McCarthy, he ruins the lives of hundreds of Americans. And he does not find one communist. Not one. And the fact that what happened is for the Republican Party here in the early 1950s, he became a useful tool because it put here Harry Truman and the Democrats on the total defense. And to say, well, this is outrageous, this is ridiculous. Well, how did we lose China? How did the Soviets get the atomic bomb? Communists in the State Department, it makes perfect sense. Okay, well, Joe McCarthy, where are the names? I guarantee you this, if this had been any other time, you put McCarthy in 1945, 1947, he never would have gotten away with it. No way. It'd be a case more or less of put up or shut up. And really where he's getting his information from, is coming from J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover, for the most part, ignored the Ku Klux Klan and any right-wing movements in the United States for his tenure as FBI director from 1927 all the way until 1972. But he's very concerned in terms of left-wing movements. So although it's going to be ultimately referred to as McCarthyism, probably it's more accurate to be referring to it as Hooverism. So what happens is Joe McCarthy's going to hit the ground running. My God, he's getting all this attention. It's awesome. And he's just going to begin these investigations. Investigate this, investigate that, investigate that. Oh, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Because even one communist is too many communists in the U.S. government. He stressed time and time again. And ultimately, he's going to be destroyed. He should have been destroyed politically a long time before he was. He's going to be destroyed by Dwight Eisenhower. Not just, I would say, in terms of McCarthyism. The Republican Eisenhower behind the scenes is going to destroy McCarthyism. But he's also here going to destroy the career of Joe McCarthy. Because as far as Eisenhower was concerned, enough was enough. So are there comparisons? I'd say yes, in terms of the dangers here of demagoguery. Definitely. And McCarthy serves ultimately as a warning. But what Margaret Chase Smith does is tremendously heroic to take him on. Because there's no way any Democrats are going to take on Joe McCarthy. Because initially, at first, in fairness, a lot of people thought, oh, he must have something. But if you question too much, then publicly he was going to say, you, Everett Dirksen, senator, are a communist, or a pinko, or a fellow traveler. And lives were ruined in this way. So you hesitated. You had to, in fact, be very, very careful. What it's a description of and more of an illustration of is the level of fear that developed here in American domestic society, especially in 1949, but also onwards into 1950. And fear here is a motivator. Suddenly this World War II ally, and there's no doubt, to be perfectly frank with you, not to humanize Joseph Stalin, the guy was the scum of the earth. I mean, the evidence there is overwhelming. And the U.S. government knew that. But what would be the best way of dealing here with this threat? And now with both nations, with nuclear weapons, well, things are looking, quite frankly, very scary, both in terms of foreign policy as well as domestic policy. Fear of subversion here at home. Nothing had materialized so far by the summer of 1950, and perhaps something would. As far as Margaret Smith is concerned, this is all just a big charade, a big game on the part of the Wisconsin senator, who, as far as she was concerned, was a disgrace to the Republican Party, and more importantly, a disgrace to the United States. Any other questions? Okay, tomorrow we will look here at this transition, this transformation, and focus especially on the Korean War, and then getting into as well Dwight Eisenhower, the new President of the United States beginning in 1953, and the impact that he will have here in the Cold War over the decade of the 1950s. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.